Marcellus French Lowe, the subject of this sketch, was born in Atascosa County, Texas on March 28, 1855. Now, Marcellus was the first white child born in Atascosa County. Now, from there, him and his family moved to McMullen County on the Frio River. And his father, James Lowe Sr., was a cattleman. And he had extensive cattle interests in the Southwest, and he established several branch ranches, one of which was on the Nueces River, about 35 miles from his place of residence. And he called that the San Jose Ranch. Now, in charge of that ranch was an old Mexican hired hand who was a remuda, that is, one who was in charge of horses, and the horses would be a remuda. In 1871, the elder Lowe sent his son Marcellus, who was then 14 years of age, and one of his hired men, who was just a boy the same age, named Sam Heritage, to the San Jose Ranch after a herd of about 80 head of horses. Now, they were to carry these horses to the Alligator Lake, where they were there to meet Moses McLean, a man who was in the employ of Mr. Lowe Sr. on one of his ranches. Now, Moses had written or sent word to Mr. Lowe that he was in need of these horses, and he would be at Alligator Lake on a certain day and would be there to receive them if he would have them sent down. So Mr. Lowe, of course, sent his young son Marcellus with his hired boy, who arrived at the ranch late in the evening. Now, the ranch house wasn't really anything fancy. It was just a small picket house, and it stood on rising ground overlooking a mesquite flat toward a draw or ravine. Now, about sundown, a family by the name of Springfield drove up in an old ox wagon, and there was Mr. Springfield with his wife and 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And the family camped near the ranch house. And they were coming in from Black Creek going to Alligator Lake, and that's why they came and spent the night with Lowe, who they knew. Now, early the next morning, the old Mexican went out and brought up the horses which were sent for, and young Lowe, who was acquainted with the Springfield family, went out and asked the family if they'd like to come into the house for breakfast. Now, Mr. Springfield said no, they had already had their breakfast, and they would go ahead and go on. Now, about that same time, the old man had the ox hitched to the wagon and was just getting ready to start out. And Marcellus had gone back into the house, but in a minute or so, the Mexican remuda ran into the yard with a pony, exclaiming, "Indios, Indios!" In other words, Indians, Indians. Now, at that time, rapid shots were heard just east in the direction taken by the Springfield family. They had crossed a little creek, and they were just on a ground rising about 200 yards away. Now, young Lowe ran to the door of the house, and he looked up. The sun was just rising, and the wagon with the family were in plain sight, and he could clearly see that the wagon had been surrounded by a large band of mounted Indians. And these Indians, who were probably left-hand Apache, were shooting towards the wagon with guns and arrows. Mr. Springfield could clearly be seen fighting them and trying to defend his family, and everybody in the family wagon got out, and they were all screaming. One of the little boys was riding a horse, and he attempted to escape on that horse, but 2 mounted Indians ran alongside him, and one of them jerked him off his horse and placed him behind his own horse that he was riding. The little fellow tried hard to pull loose from the Indian, but he was unable to do so. Now, Marcellus Lowe could plainly hear the screams of Mrs. Springfield. She kept crying out, "Oh, for God's sake, Marcellus, come and help us." That was repeated several times, but the boy was totally unarmed, and it would have only amounted to a useless sacrifice of his own life if he'd have responded to the appeal. But Marcellus Lowe said he would never forget that heart-rending appeal to him for help from that lady, and the tone of that poor woman's voice as it floated out in that early morning breeze, it has never been erased from his mind. After it was all over, the Indians faced toward the house like they were going to attack it, but after consulting with one another, they decided to just take the 80 horses, and then they took off. And by this time, of course, the group of individuals were getting themselves together, and the old Mexican remuda took control. He only had 1 revolver. That was the only gun they had in the group. But at that time, they heard a little girl crying at the gate, and they went out to see who it was. It was one of the little Springfield girls. She hadn't been killed. She had managed to escape, but she had lance wounds in several places on her body. And of course, the first thing she thought about was her mom and dad, and she wanted to go back to see how they were. And so they all went out there, with the exception of the little girl who had been nursed by the Mexican employee's wife. But the rest of them, including Marcellus Lowe, went out to see the Springfield family. And of course, they were all had been shot to pieces and full of arrows. And so they gathered them together and they buried all the bodies right there on the spot. And now, later on, of course, Marcellus Lowe, when he grew up, he became a judge. And he was a judge in the county seat of Frio County, which would have been Pearsall. That's where he served. After having gone to college in North Carolina, Bingham's College in North Carolina, he returned to Texas, and he remained there, of course, and he became a member of the legislature, the 19th Texas legislature, and then became a county judge there in Frio County. But this is one of the many adventures, true-to-life accounts of Indians versus settlers in Texas.